The Household Part 1. As far as was politically feasible, the sultans ruled the empire through members of their own household, whom they had appointed to government office. This was a tendency which began probably in the late 14th century, and had become very pronounced by the late 15th. In its structure, the sultan's court was typical of any large household in the Ottoman Empire, or in the Islamic world. It was larger, richer and more magnificent than the households of viziers, provincial governors or other wealthy Muslims, but not, in its essentials, different. Relatively few members of the imperial household were legally free: the sultan himself, his children and other family members, teachers and religious instructors, prayer leaders, doctors, the mutes, dwarves and wrestlers who served for his entertainment, and a few others. The rest were slaves. In a great Muslim household, however, to be a slave was not necessarily to occupy a menial position, and the affection in which owners often held their slaves or manumitted slaves is evident from the many deeds of trust which name them as beneficiaries. Furthermore, servile status did not necessarily imply a low social position. A person's rank in society depended less on their status as slave or free person than on the status of the family or household to which they belonged. A slave in a wealthy and powerful household could enjoy greater prestige than a person who was free but poor. It was proximity to the great that bestowed repute. The most honored position below that of sultan himself was to be his slave, and it was, as far as possible, through their slaves that the sultans ruled the empire. The sultan acquired some of his slaves as gifts. Bayezid II, 1481–1512, for example, received the Genoese lad, Menevino, who served as a page from 1505 until his escape in 1514, from a pirate. Others he purchased. Murad IV bought the Pole, Babavai, who served as a palace musician until his dismissal in 1657, from the Tatars who had captured him in a raid. Others came as prisoners of war. The most bounteous source, however, was the collection, the levy made, on the sultan's own non-Muslim subjects. A few, such as the Abkhazian Grand Vizier, Melek, the Angel, Ahmed Pasha, 5 were not slaves, but had received an education in the palace after presentation to the sultan. From the time of its completion in the 1470s, the most favored of the sultan's slaves received their education at the new palace, in the great and small chambers in the third court. This was not, however, the only site of a palace school. Some such institution had presumably existed in the old palace at Edirne in the 14th century, and the first half of the 15th, and a school continued to function in the new palace in that city even after Istanbul had become the main residence of the sultan. Within Istanbul, there were schools. Outside the palace itself, the first of these was the Galata Palace, a foundation of Bayezid II, 1481–1512. The other, after 1536, was the Palace of Ibrahim Pasha on the square of the Hippodrome. Nonetheless, the school in the third court remained the most prestigious. In Babavai's day in the mid-17th century, a page had to serve an apprenticeship in one of the outer palaces before admission to the greater or lesser chamber. The pages, the Genoese Menevino tells us, entered the palace school 80 to 100 at a time. They first learned to speak vulgar Turkish and Apos, the lingua franca of the palace and of the empire's cosmopolitan elite. After 5 or 6 days, they began to work on the alphabet. The boys spent the entire day under the supervision and fierce discipline of the eunuchs and the masters of the school. These taught them the alphabet, to read and recite the Quran, and the articles of the Islamic faith. They could then proceed to study Arabic and Persian, both vulgar and learned, 2 languages that were essential for writing and understanding literary and official Turkish, and which were both in use for keeping legal and financial records. Menevino entered the palace school in 1504. When Babavai came there a century and a half later, the curriculum seems hardly to have changed. The purpose of the education, Babavai emphasizes, was not to make great scholars of them, and not to demand more than a great respect for books, especially for the Quran and Apos. Their progress, he says, depended on their own interests. Those who studied Islamic law could hope eventually to acquire a lucrative position as imam at one of the royal mosques. Those who mastered Persian and calligraphy could hope to become clerks to the treasury, the imperial council, or in the household of a great man. Those who studied law and the ordinances of justice might acquire a governorship. Since the pages were ultimately to form a military class, they also received instruction in the military arts, Babavai describing their training and skills in archery, horsemanship, wrestling and javelin throwing. A graduate of the palace schools had therefore received both a martial and a literary training. In both aspects, however, their education remained medieval. Their military prowess belonged, by the 17th century, to the sports field rather than to the battlefield, and it was still the medieval Persian classics that formed their literary tastes. During their period of education, Menevino and Babavide tell us, the lads could not leave the palace, their only contact with the outside world being through the eunuchs called the gate boys and apos. Their formal education ended, Menevino tells us somewhat inconsistently, at the age of 25. Babavide says after 7 or 8 years in apos. Those who were to leave appeared before the sultan who, in Menevino's time, gave each one a cloak of brocade and one of his best horses, and admonished them, if anyone has seen a wrongdoing in the palace, they should not make it known, but keep it to themselves. Those who left the palace at this time normally, it seems, joined one of the 6 divisions of cavalry attached to the palace. This was not an exclusively military or ceremonial position, although these cavalrymen fought in battle and rode on either side of the sultan on campaign, and in processions. Members of these divisions, as educated men, often had other functions, notably as tax collectors. Attachment to the palace cavalry was, the Venetian Ramberty observed in the mid-16th century, like a ladder to mount to higher positions and apos. A cavalryman might also receive as wife a girl from the imperial harem, who, like him, would be a slave of the sultan. Not all the lads did leave the palace on completing their education. Those who remained became pages of the chambers of the inner palace, directly serving the person of the sultan. The organization of the chambers, as Menevino describes it, remained largely intact at the time of Babavide. The chamber with the lowest status was, it seems, the larder where, Menevino says, 25 pages of 20 to 22 years, serving under a eunuch, are charged with the care of this room where there are juleps, sweets and all sorts of spices and everything necessary for the private cuisine of the sultan and apos. Above the pages of the larder, and, again under the eye of a eunuch, came the pages of the treasury, responsible for the sultan's personal treasure in the third court, where there are various sorts of garments of brocade, gold and silver, vessels of many kinds, jewels and money. To these Ahmed I, 1603-17 and Murad IV respectively added and enlarged the campaign chamber, which Babavide describes as the chamber of the pages who serve the sultan when he goes on journeys and apos. The most prestigious, however, was the privy chamber.